Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Inside Opera. We have a wonderful and very special guest today. Michael Mori is currently Artistic Director of Tapestry in Toronto, and he's also worked as a singer and performer, as a director, choreographer with UBC Opera, with Musica Intima in Vancouver, and he's directed as far afield as St. John's and Dallas. So we're really thrilled to have him here, and we're going to discuss some issues about operas that have grappled with the social issues of their time. As almost any fan or student of opera will already know, our sort of hybrid mutt of an art form began its life somewhere around 1600 as an entertainment for the aristocratic and royal families who could afford to pay for them and could use them to entertain their guests. It was an exclusive art form at the very beginning. According to the historian Richard Cheruskin, opera as we know it more formally begins in 1637 with the construction of the first public opera house in Venice. This means that we could buy tickets and go to see operas, and ultimately the tastes of the public would, for better or worse, begin influencing the subject matters chosen by composers. Now, one of the first works of real stature that makes an attempt to recreate in contemporary terms a play that has been highly critical of the ruling class and the systemic inequalities was Mozart's Marriage of Figaro in 1786. And following fairly closely on that is, to this day, one of the great works about political injustice, Beethoven's Fidelio of 1805. So there has been something of a history of this, but the issue, of course, is very, very broad. And so I'm very happy to be able to ask Michael just to tell us a little bit about your feelings and your experiences dealing with music theater works that address issues beyond the historic and the mythological.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to virtually be visiting Victoria, which is one of my favorite cities. My family moved to Vancouver in the 40s, and so there's a long history of BC in my family.
Great.
And I miss the ferry ride. Having lived in Toronto now for almost 9 years, it's such a beautiful thing to be able to do a couple times a year. So I'm happy to be here, and this is honestly, this is where I obsess all of the time, is how sort of society and our time relates to the art that we create. So I think this will be a good one. Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, Tapestry Opera, where I'm artistic director, I think of us as the oldest fashioned opera company in Canada, because we're doing opera the way that opera was done when it was being created for Puccini and for Mozart. In a certain way, we're practicing the way that opera companies used to practice, which was by producing new works, because no one was doing old works. Historically, it's a fad of the 20th century, mostly. So, and about the practice of recording sort of coming into existence. So I think that it's just intrinsic in great art. We have a relationship with what's going on right now. Artists are very conscientious, and they're very open-minded people, always exploring big questions of the day. And there's no doubt that there's going to be intersections. Beethoven renamed one of his symphonies. It was supposed to be named after Napoleon because he was such a great person, and then he discovered the flaws of Napoleon and changed it. I think
that was number 3.
Yeah.
Change the definition.
Yeah. Apologize.
Don't apologize. I'll just let the audience know that Michael's wee baby, Naomi, who was born on February 29th of this year, is alternately sleeping and offering her own commentary. We don't have sophisticated enough subtitles to share the details of her remarks with you at the present time.
Yeah, she's going to think I'm so old-fashioned by the time she's my age. So I think it's
long before that, Michael.
Okay, 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, if this proves to be a barrier, we can pause. I have permission to transport her in 4 minutes upstairs.
Okay, no worries.
But there we go. Let's see eye to eye there.
Hi. Gave me away.
Okay, so I'm just going to pick up where I left off, which was kind of I mean, it's a tricky question. The question of how does, what operas relate most to the times they're in, or what operas are concerned most with the concerns of the societies they're created in. I've always thought about Marriage of Figaro, but then I had an interesting discussion recently where someone criticized me for mentioning Mozart because he's relatively apolitical in a lot of his other works. But at the same time, we know that he was critical of the nobility, probably because he always had to go to them for money, and he couldn't just do what he wanted to do, and he wasn't getting the positions that he was looking for. So something that was critical of them obviously made sense. But Beaumarchais is someone, and Da Ponte in that coexistence is someone who's obviously far more politically active, artistically, and I just think that's baked into the blood of great art, the creation of great art. And Wozzeck, another favorite one, which is taking on the middle class for the first time, kind of doing the opposite of what Marriage of Figaro did, and also at the same time doing so with both the music and Büchner's great play. It's not a new conversation. That's the thing for me, is that so-called social justice or progressive movements are just about the life and breath of what a culture is dealing with at any time, and that's going to be reflected in the art. I don't know, honestly, any creators who have been commissioned to write a political piece. I know lots of creators who have been commissioned to write a piece that means something to them, that happens to intersect with the politics that are going on, because that's our life. That's the life, that's the world, those are the situations that we're facing. And it's compelling for us. It was really, really interesting. I got to direct Dead Man Walking in California, about within 100 kilometers of one of the biggest death rows in the US. And it was controversial there. And I did the research, and of course, Canada had its last capital punishment in 1970 something, which was still quite strange. But I also am anti-capital punishment. But it was great. It was great to see people come and engage with that and protest it, and also write letters afterwards and say it was the most moving opera that they'd seen, because it was engaging us in our own stories and issues, and it wasn't just an exercise in escapism, in artistic escapism, which some people consider the primary purpose of classical music.
Okay, that's interesting, because also Dead Man Walking has done something that not a lot of operas did as long ago as the 1970s, which is to be revived with various opera companies. It has proven to have some real staying power. And one can say the same of operas like Dr. Atomic by John Adams or Nixon in China, that they have the opportunity to reach new audiences because different companies recreate them. And certainly in my youth, that when you put on a new opera, it was expensive. You needed a lot of subsidy, and it was produced once. And then at that point, it had no cachet anymore. So no companies wanted to squander their resources on it.
I'm going to relocate the noisemaker, and then we'll pick up exactly there.
Okay, bye, Naomi. It's interesting what you said earlier about somebody criticizing the inclusion of The Marriage of Figaro in any discussion of operas that deal with social and contemporary issues, on the basis of the likelihood that Mozart, although he liked to keep abreast of current issues, was not deeply political in the same way that Beethoven was. However, I was reading recent biographies of Verdi, who was a politician. He did perform civic service, and of course, he's so closely associated with the Risorgimento and the independent movement of Italy. And yet, we look at works of his that were based on contemporary French plays, most particularly Rigoletto and La Traviata. And in the first, he confronts us with the absolutely amoral and selfish behavior of someone who is essentially a narcissistic sociopath and also a ruler. which may resonate today for some people. And then there's also the other one that insists that we look at a discarded female, a member of a class that was not even acknowledged on the streets of a city like Paris or Milan, and we have sympathy for her. It demands that we give our affection and our empathy to this woman. But nothing suggests that Verdi was anything but a reluctant politician. What he was is someone who always looked for a really good story and an unconventional one. And you mentioned when we had a telephone call, La Bohème as a work that also looks, and we wouldn't necessarily think of that as the first opera that comes to mind, but it does make us look at society in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like Verdi and Puccini were successful not only because of the stories that they selected, but because of the dramatic changes they did to orchestration. But in the case of La Bohème, which so many people think of as one of their first opera loves, it's perfectly well-paced drama. It's portraying the poor class, and that's not something that opera had been doing. It had been really exalting. There'd been a lot of myth and fable, lots of Greek content or courtly content. It was all about glorifying the important people who were often paying for the opera. And this was a clear gesture from the composer and creative team to engage with the question of the audience who's coming to the show. Whether that was intentional or not, that is a reason that it's so successful, is there's a commonality in that struggle and story and the idea of love as a student when everything's fresh and larger than life. Bohème was essentially that. There's a lot of social norms that were broken in what he did, and so I think that the template's always been there. And so when we make contemporary opera, if it's truly contemporary with the times, then it's going to be political. Interestingly, it's going to challenge us, and ideally also be beautiful and memorable. But it should be great theater. That's the opportunity that we have when I think we have the conditions that are different from the time of Handel, when that was more a multi-purpose space. You go and you socialize, and you might go to the same show a number of times in order to meet with a certain person or have an affair, or simply to do something because there wasn't any entertainment at home when you went home. That's a different thing. And I think dealing with earlier operas that were created for a different social function. But when we get to sort of Puccini's time, and the function is to a good night of entertainment, and it's a nice tight drama, I think it's interesting to look at how people pick the stories that they pick then. And that tradition has continued.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Handel. One of the things that makes it clear that people were very aware that they were going to hear and see stories that were centuries and centuries old. It was the Beggar's Opera in 1728, which basically says, hey, you go in the theater and you have your escapist entertainment, come outside, and it's a world of pickpockets, thieves, prostitutes, and they deserve an opera with a happy ending too.
Yeah, I mean, and that culture counterculture conversation is very interesting. It's very interesting, and the idea of what's popular and then what's present is interesting. It's like, what is actually a fad? And you see Italian opera being a fad in England, that has a certain curve to it, and then and sort of the general absence of through almost a couple hundred years of notable British composers, and then you have the counter reactions to it, which are fascinating. And yeah, that's a great point.
And as an artistic director yourself, and as someone who's directed a very wide variety of pieces, what influence or role do you see the audience having in choosing material to set? Not necessarily works to decide to program, but if you're in a position to commission a work or to work collaboratively with the creative team, what role does the audience's taste or desires have in that?
Well, this is maybe, you may not have been expecting this to be a loaded question, but I think this is actually one of the most important questions. And what I've seen is that a lot of operas have been commissioned in the last, let's say, 15 years, maybe more, specifically to sound like old operas. to appeal to the people who already love opera, to be close enough to the operas that they know and love. And so you have echoes of sort of mid-century Copland and Americanism in south of the border. You have a lot of people who are sort of riffing off of film music, which is our post-romantic era, and or late romantic as well. And I think that's both that's an interesting limitation, because if we consider only the existing audience of opera, we're narrowing the opportunity to engage with the general public, or the general public who could be interested in art, music, theater, which is what we do. And so if you ask the question of what will the public be engaged with, as opposed to what will my subscription audience be engaged with, then I think the answer is far more interesting. And also it's like, there's a critical argument to be had. Why would this story that's about a Black Atlantis that was populated by the 1.4 million people who went overboard during the Middle Passage, why would that be something that would be interesting for the public? And is that a new story, or is it going to feel like something that we've already seen? How does nostalgia play into what we expect at the opera, which is, I think, very, very strongly. And, but there's different ways to access nostalgia. Does it have to all sound kind of like, does it have to sound like Strauss? Or if it's going to be something that's a sweeping romance, does it have to sound like Wozzeck if it's a psychological thing? Where can we have a beautiful balance of something that allows us some kind of escapism, which is not bad necessarily, but also engages us, has a lot of resonance with the things that we're thinking about and the identity we have ourselves. And that does tie into, who's not represented in the audience, who's not represented on stage. If we're so consistent with the creators and the stories that we show on stage to say, actually, it may not feel intentional to those who do it because we love this and we're doing it because it's a beautiful art form, but the practical nature of it is you're showing a bunch of European men's perspectives on stage, usually directed and conducted by people of a similar background. And so in Canada, where the population is close to 50% people who are not European in background, there's an opportunity, or missed, because it's like a exclusion by factor of not considering that what we're doing is exclusionary. And so there's another consideration for the public. Is the public going to be interested in this? Well, if it's echoing things that are already triggers for people who have been marginalized by the system, maybe not. If it's something that says, hey, look, you can tell by the story or by the creator or by the kind of music or by all three and more that this is something that belongs as much to you as to anyone, and there's going to be some crazy beautiful singing, then there's a great argument for what can engage the public. And, you look at the waltz. The waltz was basically like a folk dance that was considered immoral because people's hips touched, and it was in outside music that made its way into the Viennese culture and then into Viennese operetta. And that's really interesting because that's a great example of cross-cultural pollinating, where we're bringing in forms that resonate with a different population, and not the non-majority population. And that's making the art stronger and more interesting and develop and have resonance in ways that that it should.
Yes, it's interesting to bring in another group, which we mentioned when we had a phone conversation before this, just I'm referring to it a couple of times, is that roughly 35 years after Stonewall, Pacific Opera and Opera de Montreal and Edmonton Opera, all three in a row. Pacific Opera collaborated with Montreal Opera and commissioned and mounted a production of Les Feluettes, which is one of the great gay plays that's come out of the French Canadian theater. And if you had asked, I would imagine, a lot of people on the street, would you like to see a play about gay prisoners that enact revenge for an unjust act? Or would you like to see a story in which the central pair of lovers is two men? I would imagine a lot of them would have said no, or they would have at least said, well, I'll go because I know I should be interested. But actually the work moved people very deeply and very genuinely. So I always feel if you have something that you want to put on and it's honestly enough felt and artistically enough stated, people have a much wider range of interest than they know they do.
Sure. I mean,
more
in the same way that people would talk about what is Traviata, oh, it's this heartbreaking romance and tragedy, not a story about a prostitute. You know, because we can. Yeah, I think great creators will find they're going to find the universal human condition and things that we can all feel and see ourselves in some way, and tell that. And in fact, as you say, one of the great things about this is. And I said this when we were working on OKSANA G, which was a piece that dealt with human trafficking, and there were difficult moments in it. One of the things about human trafficking is that it's in the news when it's a notable story, and then it's the news cycle moves on, and we don't ever get to spend more than the 5 minutes of shock and anger and upsetness and discomfort to see the human side of that. And that's the thing that opera does, is you have potentially up to 3 hours, or 5 in the case of Wagner, or more. But you have 3 hours to live with a character, get to know them, get to feel the humanity of them, and then realize, oh, right, Violetta was a courtesan or prostitute. Wozzeck was someone who was mentally ill. You know, in the case of Oksana was a normal girl who ended up being traded for into the sex trade, and unwillingly so, and then was considered a prostitute. And that's like people that we see and would consider prostitutes and maybe avoid on the streets. I'm not going to speak for anyone, but it does happen. A lot of these people had situations that were beyond their control, but spending time with them brings them humanity. And I do think there's something there that it's not explicitly political, but it is a few steps to make situations where we may not be, you know, we don't normally walk in someone else's shoes, but we can open our hearts and our minds over those 3 hours and maybe walk out at least a little bit more human than we did when we walked in.
Absolutely. And also, once we've been touched, I think you can't be untouched. And too often a paragraph in a newspaper, particularly in these days of social media, we're bombarded with so many tiny little facts. It's very hard for them to make an imprint. And I remember seeing a production of the work Missing that appeared in our small space, the Bauman. And you cannot leave a production like that unmoved and unaffected, particularly if you're a member of the 50% of the population for whom this is not part of your story. In other words, we had all read about all of these missing women. We all knew that they had been victimized by, as you said, circumstances completely beyond their control. And then again by the society that was so indifferent to what happened to them, and then further and by federal government that actually stated that they were not in their sights, that their predicament was not going to be noticed. So we read that and it's infuriating, but for it to have become emotionally involving and searing, it took that opera. Or at least that.
Yeah, I think, look, I love opera. I love opera from historical to the newest stuff to the crazy out there stuff, because of this the fact of opera, the power that it can somehow break through the guard that we put up and make us feel things that we normally feel in our own intimate, moments in our life. And that strange intimacy and very human relationship is rare and worth trying to repeat. If that makes sense. To have more compassion and empathy, to have something that can create more compassion and empathy is what opera can do, in addition to transporting us to some place wonderful.
Yes, or not so wonderful. I mean,
Or not so wonderful.
you mentioned Wozzeck earlier. I don't know whether I would want to be living in his village or his barracks.
No, certainly not. Yeah, that's also like we see genres in film so clearly now. There is something also for the genre of horror or the genre of psychological fiction, thriller. Like those are, I think it's like going to the different areas of the human psyche and turning on things normally express. The thing I love about opera is that it cracks through the barriers that we put up, the way that we get about our business. You can't just be an open, emotive person or entity the entire time burned out. But as a result, sometimes we're too closed. And the thing that opera can do is it can open us up, both, as we've been talking about, to the story of someone who's not like you, from any different situation, to transport us both into beautiful scenarios or scenarios of intimacy that, we normally sort of cache those memories away, but also into like places, as you were saying about Wozzeck, that we may not want to be in. And I think about the genres that we have in movies like thriller or horror, rom-com, there's a place, there's a very human place for all of those things. And it's in exploring a situation and emotion. Often it has resonance with us, but also makes us open for that moment in time in a safe way, in a beautiful way. And is still worth exploring, worth creating art for. And that's why it's so important to consider the purpose. Are we going to try and make more operas that sound like Fledermaus, or more operas that sound like Strauss, or are we going to investigate time? And talking about the intersections with social justice and opera, I think asking the question, what music does our society deserve? What art music and art storytelling does our society deserve right now from our great creators? And how important is it that we give them, honestly, 10 chances to write an opera so that they can do the thing that Verdi and Mozart did, which was not really write a good one until the 5th or 6th, Mm-hmm. I think that there's an important opportunity for our great creators, give them opportunities, ask the honest question, is this the music of our country? And how can it more take advantage in a greater way of that? In the same way, if you're in the supermarket now versus 50 years ago, 30 years ago, what was available 30 years ago in the supermarkets? You say, like, now you can get a mango almost any time. I'm not a tropical person, so I'm not going to eat the mango. It's just, hey, look at all of the ingredients that we can include at home or at the restaurant. And I think the same way about music and opera. Of course, we should be taking account of these here in our society. And so there's a question about what is the orchestration, in addition to who's telling the stories and who's on stage, and how is that an opportunity for us in the same way that all of the composers we're talking about have. Mozart, Verdi, Puccini specifically were people who really innovated our orchestration. And I think us being frozen at this sort of early 20th century version or late 19th century version of orchestra is kind of crazy. So that's, again, where I'm really interested in what's possible.
Great. Now, speaking of what's possible, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days with Tapestry?
Well, I'll first talk about what we would be doing if COVID wasn't a thing. And so for example, this past year, one of the projects that we did was called Augmented Opera, and this was exploring, expanding the sensory palette of the operatic experience. So we did a show that was half blindfolded, where there were scents and there was basically taking the idea of what augmented reality is in philosophy, which is taking what is real and in front of you and augmenting it with different artifice. So not just having, a virtual reality headset on plus other things, but actually doing what theater's always done best and raising the question of what is real and what isn't. So we had singers walking around singing, but also with Bluetooth speakers on that also had singing and talking on it. So there was the question of what is recorded, what is a real person. The idea of space was there. The character, this was actually based on Orpheus and Eurydice, and it was Eurydice going back in time and reconsidering something that had happened to her, a contemporary Eurydice, and it was three time periods of her looking back on her life. The moment it happened, sort of 10 years later, and then her as an older woman, and how different perspective changes with time. And so we were hearing those up concurrently. So there was another nice play in the structure, and a shout out to Debbie Wong, who was my collaborator on that, who was in Vancouver. So that was one of the things, but it was, for me, that was an exciting way to play with form and with how the execution of an opera has taken on. There was also a multi-tonal instrument that was programmable, multiphonic, so we could do any sort of division you like. I think we were working with something like, I don't know, 30 notes to the octave with that one. And another recent Vancouver resident, Benton Rourke, was the composer and provided a great score for that. What else has been going on? I mean, we've done experiments that have taken us to collaborations with punk rock artists and hip hop artists, and really looking for people who are on the same journey of exploration and trying to find resonance with their art. So coming up, we have a co-commission with Opera Philadelphia that I can't announce the title of because it hasn't been released yet, but that's coming up in a couple of years, that will also deal with some interesting intersections with our developing understanding of maybe the intersection of feminism and the history of mental illness. There's going to be this coming June, so slightly less than a year from now, we're working on a piece that's about the mythology of the dragon boat, and how that intersects with the Canadian immigrant story between a first-generation father and a second-generation daughter of Chinese background. So kind of using the story of Xu Yan, who was a very famous poet, one of the most famous poets pre-foundation of China, and how his sacrifice allowed the country to flourish, and the idea of the sacrifice that first-generation parents make for their children, and is often not appreciated. So in a kind of both historical mythology and contemporary identity story, that's going to come up in an outdoor performance on the lake in June. Fingers crossed, but we do believe that outdoor performances are the way to go right now with our understanding of COVID. We have 3 other major commissions that are upcoming, with Brian Current, who wrote Missing, of course, and Liza Balkin is his librettist, and that's going to be a story about Glenn Gould, and with performers climbing a wall as they perform, kind of echoing the story of Glenn Gould's journey in this constant pursuit of climbing and climbing and climbing of perfection. Yes, oh gosh, this I don't want to say too much, but this is our big premiere next season. So this will be 2022. I'm considering that we're in 2021 right now. So in a year and a half is going to be a big robot opera relating to the 100th anniversary of Karl Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots, which was the proto-robot play, which actually invented the word robot. So now 100 years later, this piece is written by Nicole Lizet and with a libretto by Governor General Award winner Nicolas Bion. And it's kind of taking on the convergence of big data and AI and robotics in companies like Facebook and Google, and rethinking the robot story for our times, and how that music intersects with the idea of artificial intelligence becoming intelligence, and what is it when there's a a collective machine intelligence that has a capacity that we can't even imagine. And what would that sound like? What would that music sound like? And we'll be playing with some ideas of surround music. So that's sort of 360-degree sound design integrated into moving orchestration. So again, playing around with the idea of where the pit is. Very excited about that one. That's going to be a very special one. So a big season coming up after this next one. For now, we're taking it basically very safely, and we've moved all of our programming from 2021 to 2021-22, except for the outdoor show, and instead we'll be doing a number of things, but a lot of digital commissions for online opera shorts, and I think playing with the genre in a different way. People think of opera as a long experience, and sometimes there's a lot that we can learn from sketch comedy in terms of experimenting with like what has resonance at this moment. So you can see a couple of our first endeavors on our website or on our YouTube page. But that's been fun. And actually this Monday, which I believe this will air after, so I can say it, we're launching a trailer stage, which is going to be towed behind a car. It's going to go to porches all around Toronto. It's going to go to care homes and hospitals and grocery stores at closing to perform for frontline workers for free. And we're going to be doing concerts with one performer. So the performer stays on their stage. People can stay in their homes or just outside of their businesses. And we'll be bringing live music to people, because I don't think in the summer people want to look at the computer any more than they have to.
Yeah, I agree, Michael. We're doing very similar things, although not creating works, but we're certainly getting some of our younger singers out there to be heard. But congratulations, that all sounds incredibly exciting, and I want to thank you so much for being a guest.
My pleasure.
And we'll look forward to staying in touch. And everybody, have a look at the Tapestry website and the Tapestry page on YouTube. It sounds like some exciting things to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's only going to be growing this year. It's obviously a different time for everyone, and I have so much respect for what Pacific Opera Victoria is doing. A lot of great innovation there and thoughtful people. But Robert, you're officially invited for dinner anytime you're in Toronto when we can safely do so, because I feel like the conversation has just started.
Well, likewise, Michael, thanks so much. And I'm going to send this off. It'll have to be edited because of there's quite a few freezes. But that's nothing we can do about that. I like Naomi's participation, so I'm going to lobby to keep that in.
Yeah. And, actually, this is a small thing I'll just say, probably not for the recording, but we've been talking a lot about trying to mentor that it's safe to parent as an executive, and to not try and hide that fact. And a lot of women are discouraged from or taken out of the workforce. And then if they have children as a potential obstruction to doing their job well, then it's seen as something that makes them less professional. And I think that's something that is unfortunate, and we need to get around the stigma of. So we have intentionally included childcare as part of our, and child inclusion as part of our strategy.
Good.
Just as in a small way.
Good. Well, absolutely. You're all invited over here for dinner too. If you're ever in Victoria, we can do that safely. So thanks again, Michael. Terrific to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. Yeah.
And take care. And I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon.
That sounds good. Thanks so much, Robert. Take care, and all the best to Victoria.
You too. Bye-bye now.